6 months after my father called me the family disappointment at dinner, I found myself standing in the White House East Room as the President of the United States pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on my chest. But it was what he whispered next that changed everything. My nephew was one of those hostages you saved. Our family owes you everything. My parents sat in shock, finally understanding that while they'd been dismissing my military service as playing dress-up, I'd been saving lives in classified operations, including the president's own family. But this wasn't the first time I'd saved someone they'd never know about. 3 months earlier, I'd crawled through enemy fire with shrapnel in my leg to save 15 soldiers in a mission so classified that even my commanding officers didn't know the full scope. And it all started with a helicopter crash that should have killed us all. This is how the most powerful man in the world had to tell my parents who their daughter really was, and how 42 lives hung in the balance of a mission nobody was supposed to survive. I'm Alexandra Carter, and that journey to the White House began in the pristine suburbs of Cambridge, Massachusetts, where the Carter family had always been about control. We lived in a colonial house where success was measured in academic achievements and prestigious degrees. My father, Dr. Jonathan Carter, served as Dean of Engineering at MIT. My mother, Dr. Sarah Carter, had made her name as a research physicist. My older brother Marcus followed their blueprint perfectly: Harvard Business School, Wall Street executive, everything golden. But their obsession with mapping out perfect futures hadn't always existed. When I was 12, my younger sister Emma died in a car accident, a drunk driver running a red light on her way home from soccer practice. I watched my parents transform overnight from supportive educators into controllers who couldn't bear the thought of losing another child to the unpredictable world. "We're going to make sure you and Marcus have safe, stable careers," my mother announced a week after Emma's funeral, her voice hollow with grief and determination. "No risks, no uncertainty, no surprises." From that moment, my path was predetermined engineering or physics indoor careers, where the greatest danger might be eye strain. They enrolled me in advanced math camps, hired tutors, and surrounded me with their colleagues' children who were already on the right path. But while they were building walls to protect me, my grandfather was quietly showing me a different way to live. Sergeant William Bill Carter had served as a combat medic in World War II. While my parents rarely spoke about his service, I was fascinated by the stories he shared when we were alone in his study. "I didn't save the world in some fancy lab, Alex," he'd tell me, his weathered hands tracing the edges of his purple heart. "I saved it one soldier at a time, right there in the mud and blood of Normandy. Every life mattered. Every heartbeat I kept going was someone's son, someone's father going home." Despite the pull toward military service, I knew I had to try their path first. I owed them that much after Emma's death. One semester at Boston University's College of Engineering nearly broke me. While my classmates breathed calculus and dreamed in differential equations, I sat in lecture halls feeling like I was drowning. By October, I was failing 3 out of 5 classes. The breaking point came during a physics exam when I realized I wasn't just failing their expectations, I was failing myself by trying to become someone I wasn't meant to be. That's when I found Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez at the military recruitment table in the student union. She talked about purpose instead of prestige, about medical training that prepared you to make life and death decisions in seconds. The conversation with my parents happened over Sunday dinner. "I'm enlisting in the Army," I said. "I want to be a combat medic." "The military," my father said, barely controlled. "Alexandra, the military is for people who can't make it anywhere else." "We can't lose another child," my mother whispered, tears starting. "We can't. Not after Emma." Marcus actually laughed. "Playing soldier. You know they'll just stick you in some office filing papers, right?" 2 weeks later, I stood at the bus station with a single duffel bag and my enlistment papers. My parents hadn't come to see me off. They were too disappointed to participate in this mistake. As the bus pulled away from everything I'd known, I felt more alone than ever. But I also felt the electric thrill of moving toward my authentic self. What my family didn't know was that my grandfather's war stories weren't just inspiration. They were preparation for a classified mission that would save a president's family member. The first sign I was meant for this came during my very first combat rescue. Basic training at Fort Benning became my baptism by fire, not because of the physical demands, but because for the first time in my life, I wasn't being measured against my brilliant family members. Drill sergeants didn't care about my SAT scores or my father's academic pedigree. They cared about whether I could save lives under pressure. And something magical happened when the stakes were high. While other recruits panicked during stress scenarios, my hands remained steady. When we practiced combat first aid under simulated gunfire, I moved with an instinctive confidence that surprised everyone, including me. "Carter," Drill Sergeant Hayes called out after a particularly challenging exercise, "you just treated 3 casualties while under fire and maintained situational awareness the entire time. Where the hell did that come from?" Advanced individual training at Fort Sam Houston confirmed what I'd suspected. I was born for this. Master Sergeant Rachel Torres pulled me aside after a complex trauma scenario. "Carter, you've got the hands and the head for this work," she said. "More importantly, you've got the heart. You're called to this." When deployment orders came through 82nd Airborne Division, Afghanistan, I called my parents with hope that maybe now they'd show some concern, some pride. "Afghanistan," my mother said, her voice flat. "I suppose that was inevitable." "Just keep your head down," my father added. "No heroics. No be safe. No, we're proud of you." The conversation lasted 4 minutes, but in Afghanistan I found something my biological family had never provided people who saw my worth immediately. Sergeant First Class Lisa Thompson, my squad leader, became the mentor I'd always craved. "Combat medicine isn't just about technical skills," she told me during one of our conversations on guard duty. "When everything goes to hell, you become their anchor to hope." 3 months into my deployment, that philosophy was tested in the most violent way possible. It was a Tuesday morning when our convoy hit the improvised explosive device. The blast flipped our lead Humvee like a toy, and I watched in horror as smoke poured from the wreckage. Enemy fire erupted from 3 directions as insurgents tried to capitalize on our vulnerability. Without thinking, I grabbed my medical bag and ran toward the burning vehicle. Bullets cracked the air around me, kicking up dust and sparking off metal, but all I could see was movement inside that smoking tomb. Staff Sergeant Kevin Martinez was trapped in the driver's seat, conscious but bleeding heavily. His femoral artery had been severed by shrapnel, and blood was pooling on the desert floor beneath him. "Stay with me, Martinez," I said, dropping to my knees beside the vehicle as enemy rounds pinged off the armor. "Your daughter needs her dad to come home." Working with one hand while returning fire with the other, I applied a combat tourniquet above the wound and started an IV. Martinez was going into shock, his skin pale and clammy, blood pressure dropping fast. I had maybe minutes before I lost him. The medevac helicopter was 14 minutes out. 14 minutes felt like 14 hours as I maintained pressure on the wound, monitored his vitals, and coordinated with our squad to suppress enemy fire. "Talk to me about your daughter," I told Martinez, trying to keep him conscious. "What's her name?" "Sophia," he whispered. "She's 7. I want to be a doctor like you." "I'm not a doctor," I said, adjusting his IV flow, "but I'm going to make sure you're around to see her become one." When the helicopter finally arrived, I had to low crawl with Martinez on a stretcher while our squad laid down suppressing fire. As we loaded him into the bird, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "Thank you," he said, his eyes clearing. "Sophia's going to have her dad because of you." As I watched the helicopter disappear into the desert sky, I felt a purpose so clear and powerful that my family's disapproval seemed not just irrelevant but absurd. Captain Michael Williams found me cleaning blood off my hands 20 minutes later. "Carter, you've got ice in your veins," he said. "Martinez would be dead if not for your actions today." That was some of the finest combat medicine I've ever seen. The Army Commendation Medal with Valor device that followed felt like vindication. When I called home to share the news, I actually felt excited. "Mom, I received an Army Commendation Medal with Valor device for heroism in combat. I saved a soldier's life under enemy fire." There was a pause that drained all excitement from my voice. "That's nice, dear," she said with the same tone she'd use for weather updates. "Did you hear Marcus made a partner at his firm? We're having a celebration dinner. We're so proud." As I hung up, Sergeant Thompson appeared beside me. "Blood doesn't make a family. Loyalty does. Trust does. The willingness to die for each other does." That medal was nothing compared to the Distinguished Service Cross I didn't even know I'd earned for a mission where I'd saved someone connected to the most powerful family in America. But first, my family had to completely destroy me. Thompson's words about family proved prophetic over the next 18 months. While my biological family continued their lives of academic achievements and corporate success, I was building a different kind of legacy, one measured in heartbeats preserved and lives saved. By the end of my deployment, I had 11 direct combat saves to my name. My steady performance under fire earned me promotion to sergeant ahead of schedule, with my commanding officer noting that I displayed exceptional medical skills and leadership beyond her years. The second Purple Heart came during a mortar attack on our forward operating base. Shrapnel tore through my left shoulder while I was treating wounded soldiers, but I barely noticed until after I'd stabilized 3 casualties. The medal felt like validation proof that I was exactly where I belonged. When I returned home on leave, my parents had organized an elaborate graduation party for Marcus, who'd just completed his MBA at Wharton. They'd forgotten I was arriving the same day, or perhaps they simply didn't consider my homecoming worth remembering. "Oh, Alexandra," my mother said when I appeared at the door in my dress uniform, my ribbons, including the new Purple Heart, prominent on my chest. "We weren't expecting you until tomorrow. We're having a celebration for Marcus and his MBA. You can join us, I suppose." The party was a masterclass in dismissal. My parents and Marcus dominated every conversation with stories about his academic achievements and corporate future. Charlotte, his new girlfriend from law school, made polite attempts to include me, but my family intercepted each effort. "Alexandra's just doing a stint in the military," my father explained to Charlotte. "Nothing as impressive as Marcus's corporate work." When Charlotte noticed my Purple Heart and asked about it with genuine curiosity, my mother actually rolled her eyes. "What are those colorful things?" she asked, gesturing at my ribbons, as if they were costume jewelry rather than symbols of service and sacrifice. "This one is for being wounded in combat while treating injured soldiers," I explained carefully. "The Purple Heart is specifically for wounds received in enemy action." "Fascinating," my mother interrupted, clearly uninterested. "Have you met our neighbor's daughter? She just finished her residency at Johns Hopkins. Now that's a proper medical career." The breaking point came during dinner, when Marcus, emboldened by wine and his captive audience, decided to entertain everyone with his thoughts on my career choices. "Come on, Alex," he said with that condescending smile I'd learned to hate. "You're a glorified nurse. Let's be honest about what you actually do over there. You probably tripped over some equipment, and they gave you a medal for it." Something inside me snapped. Years of dismissal, of having my service devalued, of being treated as less than, it all erupted at once. "I was wounded by enemy fire while treating soldiers under mortar attack," I said quietly, my voice carrying a dangerous edge. "I spent 18 months keeping people alive in conditions you can't imagine. One soldier died in my arms despite everything I did to save him. His name was Private Johnson, and he was 19 years old." The table fell silent, but my father's response shattered what remained of my heart. "Well, if you had gone to engineering like we wanted," he said finally, his voice cold with years of accumulated frustration, "you could be designing life-saving equipment in a proper laboratory instead of playing war hero in the desert." The word "playing" hung in the air like poison. "You've always been the family disappointment, Alexandra," he continued. "The military was just your way of running from that fact. At least Marcus had the courage to pursue real success." I stood up slowly, my hands flat on the table to hide their trembling. "In the past 18 months, I've saved more lives than I can count," I said quietly. "I've performed emergency procedures under enemy fire that most hospital doctors will never attempt. I've earned the respect of elite soldiers, and not once have any of you asked me about what I actually do." I walked out without another word, ignoring my mother's half-hearted call to come back. In my rental car parked in their perfect driveway, I finally allowed myself to break down. The tears came in racking sobs, all the stress, trauma, and rejection pouring out at once. My phone rang. Not my family, but Sergeant Thompson calling from Texas. "Hey, Carter, just checking in on your leave. How's the family reunion going?" I couldn't speak, could only manage choked sobs. "I'm on my way," she said immediately. "Text me the address. Don't move." 2 hours later, Thompson sat with me in a hotel room. "Your worth isn't determined by people who don't understand what you do," she told me fiercely. "It's determined by the lives you've saved, the soldiers who trust you, the missions you've made possible." When my leave ended, I returned to base with a formal request for permanent change of station. I needed distance not just from trauma, but from the deeper wound of family rejection. 6 months later, that same disappointment would receive a call from the Pentagon about a mission so classified even I didn't know its true impact until the president himself told me. The mission that changed everything started with 2 words: "We're going down." My permanent change of station led me to Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, where I threw myself into helping wounded warriors recover from the same traumas I'd experienced. Working with injured soldiers, I discovered something remarkable. My combat experience gave me insights that traditional medical training couldn't provide. Drawing on techniques I'd learned in the field, I developed new protocols that combined traditional medicine with combat-tested psychological approaches. The results were extraordinary. Patients in my program showed recovery rates 15% higher than standard protocols. "Carter, your innovations are making a real difference," Colonel Patricia Wright told me during my performance review. "These methods are going to change how we approach combat trauma recovery across the entire medical corps." Then came the call that would shatter my carefully rebuilt world. "Sergeant Carter," said a formal voice I didn't recognize. "Please report to the office of the Secretary of the Army at 0900 tomorrow. Dress uniform required." When I arrived at the Pentagon, Brigadier General Robert Hayes and Mr. Andrew Collins from the White House Military Office were waiting. "The actions you took during Operation Silent Retrieval have been reviewed at the highest levels," Collins explained. "Due to the classified nature of the operation, proper recognition was delayed. You're being awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. The President will present it personally." I stared at the document, unable to process what I was hearing. "Sir, I was just doing my job." "The intelligence you provided while wounded and under fire led directly to the rescue of 27 hostages and prevented 3 terrorist attacks on U.S. soil," General Hayes said firmly. 15 lives were saved by your direct medical intervention. But the mission that would put me in that White House ceremony had started months earlier on April 15th with a simple briefing that would become anything but simple. Intelligence had located 3 American aid workers captured 2 weeks earlier while delivering medical supplies to a remote village. Satellite imagery showed them being held in a heavily fortified compound in mountainous terrain, and intel suggested they would be moved within 48 hours, likely to be executed on camera. Our 12-person special operations team included elite operators from various units, and I was the only medic. The plan was surgical night insertion by helicopter precision raid, immediate extraction. "These hostages have likely been mistreated," I told the team during our medical briefing. "Expect dehydration, malnutrition, possibly torture injuries. Our priority is stabilization for transport." We launched just after midnight 2 Black Hawk helicopters cutting through the moonless Afghan sky. 20 minutes from the target, disaster struck. Warning systems screamed as our lead helicopter took ground fire from a hidden position. I watched sparks fly from our rotor assembly as hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cabin windows. Major Samantha Reynolds, our pilot, fought desperately to maintain control as multiple systems failed. "Brace for impact," she shouted. The helicopter spiraled downward, and I grabbed onto whatever I could find as we crashed into a narrow valley 3 miles from our objective. The impact threw me against the cabin wall, my medical bags scattering across the floor. When my vision cleared, I saw smoke filling the cabin and heard groans of injured personnel. Training took over. I moved immediately to the cockpit where Major Reynolds was slumped over the controls, blood streaming from a severe head wound. Her co-pilot, Lieutenant James Wright, had a compound fracture of his left arm bone protruding through his flight suit. "We need to move," Captain Davis shouted over the chaos. "Hostiles are converging on our position." I stabilized Reynolds' neck while we extracted her from the cockpit, applied pressure dressing to her head wound, and administered pain medication. For Wright, I quickly splinted his arm and gave him injectable morphine as gunfire erupted around us. The second helicopter couldn't land too much enemy fire in the narrow valley. We were on our own with 2 seriously injured pilots and an estimated 30 hostile fighters moving to surround us. Within minutes, we were in a full firefight. Our team of 12 now, with 2 seriously wounded, faced overwhelming odds in terrain that offered minimal cover. I divided my attention between returning fire and monitoring the injured moving between positions as the battle raged. When Specialist Carlos Rivera took a bullet to his thigh, I low-crawled through the firefight to reach him. "Pressure here," I instructed, guiding his hands to the wound while I prepared a tourniquet. Enemy rounds kicked up dirt inches from us, but I forced myself to focus solely on saving his life. For 4 hours, we held our defensive position as ammunition ran dangerously low. When Master Sergeant David Chen was hit in the chest, I performed an emergency needle decompression for his collapsed lung, using a penlight clenched between my teeth. What I didn't know as I treated those wounded soldiers was that one of the hostages we were supposed to rescue would change the course of my entire life. The coordinates I was about to call in while bleeding in that desert would lead to intelligence that reached the Oval Office itself. Then the real hell began, 48 hours that would save 42 American lives. The turning point in our desperate firefight came when Captain Davis realized we needed air support to survive until extraction. The problem was positioning. Someone needed to get close enough to the enemy's main position to call in precise coordinates for an airstrike. "Carter, you're the only one with a clear line of sight to their position," Davis called out during a brief lull in the fighting. Without hesitation, I crawled to the edge of our defensive perimeter, exposing myself to direct enemy fire. A bullet grazed my helmet as I raised my head to get visual confirmation of enemy positions. My hands shook as I called in coordinates over the radio, but my voice remained steady. "Strike package, this is Ground Team Alpha. Enemy positions at Grid 41S, QB 1234 5678. Danger close. Repeat, danger close." Minutes later, the thunder of fighter jets preceded explosions that silenced half the enemy positions. But our situation was still desperate. Major Reynolds' condition was deteriorating, and we had 3 more wounded team members when enemy fighters flanked our position. A grenade exploded near our makeshift aid station, sending shrapnel into my left leg. The pain was immediate and intense, but there was no time to address it. Sergeant Ryan Bennett was critically wounded in the same blast, his chest torn open by shrapnel. Despite my own injury, I dragged Bennett 20 yards to better cover, applied a chest seal to his sucking chest wound, and started an IV while using my body to shield him from incoming fire. "Stay with me, Bennett," I urged, watching his oxygen saturation drop on my portable monitor. "Your kids need you to fight." But even as I fought to save Bennett's life, I was gathering intelligence that would prove crucial in ways I couldn't imagine. The enemy communications we intercepted, their movement patterns, the layout of their defensive positions, all of it was being recorded and transmitted back to command. By noon, with enemy reinforcements arriving, Captain Davis made the difficult decision to split our team. "Carter, you take the 4 most seriously wounded and head east toward that ridgeline. The rest of us will create a diversion. 2nd Bird will extract you there." I organized the evacuation, creating improvised stretchers for Major Reynolds and Sergeant Bennett. My leg throbbed with every step as I led our small group through rugged terrain, constantly checking on the wounded while evading enemy patrols. We traveled through the night, my medical supplies dwindling with each treatment. Bennett's condition worsened despite my efforts, and I knew I was losing him. In those final hours, as I held pressure on wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding, he looked up at me with eyes that were already seeing somewhere else. "Tell my kids their dad tried to come home," he whispered. "You're going to tell them yourself," I said, but we both knew it was a lie. Bennett died in my arms as the sun rose over the Afghan mountains despite everything I'd done to save him. I'd failed to bring him home, but the intelligence we'd gathered during those desperate hours was already making its way up the chain of command. 48 hours after the crash, we reached the extraction point. The relief I felt seeing that helicopter approach was indescribable, but it was tempered by the weight of Bennett's loss and the knowledge that our original mission had failed. Back at base, I learned the remainder of our team had been extracted hours after us. The mission had been aborted. The hostages were still in enemy hands. What I didn't know then was that the intelligence we'd gathered was being analyzed by specialists who saw patterns we couldn't. The coordinates I'd called in while bleeding weren't just for air support, they'd helped map an entire network of enemy positions. The communications intercepts our team had recorded revealed connections between various terrorist cells. The movement patterns we'd observed provided crucial intelligence about supply routes and command structures. 3 weeks after our failed mission, Operation Desert Thunder was launched, using our intelligence. It was a complete success. Not only were our original 3 hostages rescued, but intelligence led to the discovery of 24 additional prisoners being held at various locations throughout the region. The network we'd identified during our desperate fight for survival was systematically dismantled, preventing 3 planned terrorist attacks on American soil that would have killed hundreds of innocent people. The mathematics were staggering: 15 lives saved by my direct medical intervention during our mission, plus 27 hostages rescued using our intelligence. 42 American lives were preserved because of 1 catastrophic helicopter crash and our refusal to give up. But I knew none of this when I received that Pentagon summons months later. I had no idea that among those 27 rescued hostages was someone whose life would create a personal connection reaching all the way to the Oval Office. The coordinates I called in while bleeding in that desert would lead to the rescue of 27 hostages, including one that would put me face to face with the president. 6 months later, that intelligence would reach the Oval Office. The true scope of Operation Silent Retrieval remained classified for months after our extraction. While I focused on my recovery and innovations at Walter Reed Military Intelligence was connecting dots, I couldn't see building a picture of how our desperate 48 hours had changed everything. During my rehabilitation, I'd thrown myself into developing new trauma recovery protocols, finding purpose in helping other wounded warriors heal. But the ghosts of that mission haunted me, especially Bennett's death and the knowledge that we'd failed to rescue those hostages. What I didn't know was that failure had become the foundation for one of the most successful counterterrorism operations in recent history. "Sergeant Carter," General Hayes had said during that Pentagon briefing, "your actions during Operation Silent Retrieval have been reviewed at the highest levels. The intelligence your team gathered led directly to Operation Desert Thunder, the rescue of 27 hostages, and the disruption of a terrorist network planning attacks on U.S. soil." As he explained the full scope of our mission's impact, I sat in stunned silence. The coordinates I'd called in while bleeding had helped map enemy positions across an entire region. The communications intercepts our team recorded revealed a network planning coordinated attacks on American cities. The movement patterns we'd observed identified supply routes that intelligence agencies had been hunting for years. 15 lives were saved by your direct medical intervention during the operation, General Hayes continued. 27 hostages were rescued using intelligence gathered by your team. 3 terrorist attacks on U.S. soil were prevented. Your actions exemplify the highest traditions of military service. Collins from the White House Military Office leaned forward. Certain details of the operation have been declassified specifically for this ceremony. The President feels strongly that your heroism should be publicly recognized. The ceremony would be in 1 week. As I left the Pentagon, still processing the magnitude of what we'd accomplished, I faced the decision I'd been dreading: should I invite my family? After that devastating dinner where my father called me the family disappointment, part of me wanted to exclude them entirely. But another part, the part that remembered being their daughter before I became their disappointment, knew I needed closure. That evening, I sent a simple text. I'm receiving a Distinguished Service Cross from the President at the White House next Thursday at 2 p.m. You're welcome to attend if you'd like. My mother's response came hours later. We'll check our schedules. Your father has a faculty meeting that might conflict. I stared at those words for a long time. A faculty meeting might conflict with their daughter, receiving one of the nation's highest military honors from the President of the United States. In that moment, their priorities became crystal clear. When they eventually confirmed they would attend, their tone suggested they were doing me a favor. But something fundamental had changed in me during those months of recovery and innovation. I was no longer a daughter desperate for approval. The ceremony wouldn't be about winning their validation. It would be about closure, about standing in my truth, regardless of who understood it. The day arrived with perfect spring weather in Washington. The White House East Room had been prepared with military precision rows of chairs for invited guests, a small stage where the president would present the medals, and the media positioned to document the moment. I arrived early, my dress uniform immaculate, every ribbon and badge placed according to regulations. 3 other service members were being honored alongside me, their families filling the front rows with proud faces and careful attention to protocol. Through a side door, I watched my family enter. They looked exactly as I'd expected, uncomfortable and out of place despite their expensive clothes. My father checked his watch repeatedly, my mother's social smile seemed forced, and Marcus kept glancing around like he was searching for someone more important. They took seats near the back, as far from the ceremony as possible, while still technically attending. Looking at them, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete emotional independence from their judgment. The ceremony began with military precision. Each recipient's story was told in turn, actions described in formal language that couldn't capture the chaos and fear of those actual moments. When my turn came, I stood at attention as the military aide read the citation that would for the first time make public the details of Operation Silent Retrieval. Sergeant Alexandra Carter distinguished herself by exceptionally valorous conduct in the face of the enemy while serving as a combat medic with Special Operations Task Force Dagger. As the citation continued, I could see my family's expressions changing from polite boredom to shock. They had never heard these details, had never known what I had actually experienced during those months when they'd dismissed my service as playing soldier. Sergeant Carter's actions directly saved the lives of 15 U.S. service members. Additionally, intelligence she provided while under fire was instrumental in a subsequent operation that rescued 27 hostages and prevented 3 planned terrorist attacks on United States soil. As I walked into that White House ceremony, I had no idea the president was about to reveal a personal connection that would change everything. Then, he leaned close and whispered the words that silenced my family forever. The president stood then, a rare departure from protocol that sent murmurs through the audience. He looked directly at me as he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the true cost of military service. "The citation doesn't tell the whole story," he said, his words reaching every corner of the silent room. "Sergeant Carter didn't just save her team. She made possible the rescue of innocent civilians being held for execution. She helped prevent attacks that would have taken American lives on our own soil. Today we recognize her extraordinary courage under the most extreme circumstances." He offered me a formal salute, the commander-in-chief saluting me before placing the medal around my neck. The weight of it against my chest felt surreal, but his next words would change everything. "Sergeant Alexandra Carter," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "you saved more American lives than anyone will ever fully know." As he shook my hand firmly, he leaned closer to speak privately, his voice barely audible over the formal proceedings. "My nephew was one of those hostages your intelligence helped rescue," he whispered. "Our family owes you a debt we can never repay." I blinked back tears as I returned to my position, the full weight of the moment crashing over me. The room erupted in applause, everyone standing except my stunned family, who seemed frozen in their seats. For the first time, they were seeing the magnitude of what they had dismissed, understanding the true scope of their daughter's service. The formal ceremony transitioned to a reception in an adjacent room where military officials, politicians, and family members of the honorees mingled over refreshments. I found myself immediately surrounded by high-ranking officers offering congratulations and thanks. "Your innovations in trauma recovery are revolutionizing our approach to combat medicine," the Surgeon General told me, shaking my hand firmly. General Hayes appeared at my side, introducing me to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. "Sergeant Carter represents the future of military medicine," he said with unmistakable pride. A group of civilians approached, escorted by a State Department official. "Sergeant Carter, these are some of the aid workers and hostages your mission helped rescue." A woman with kind eyes embraced me tightly, tears streaming down her face. "They told us what you did," she whispered. "My 5-year-old daughter still has her mother because of you. She drew you a picture of the angel soldier who brought Mommy home." Her words hit me harder than any medal could. This was why I'd joined the military, why I'd endured my family's dismissal, why I'd crawled through enemy fire with shrapnel in my leg. For moments like this, when abstract service became human connection. Camera flashes documented these interactions as media covered the ceremony. Each conversation drove home the same truth. While my family had been dismissing my service, I'd been building a legacy that reached the highest levels of government and touched families across America. Through the crowd, I spotted my parents and Marcus standing awkwardly near a wall, looking diminished in a way I'd never seen before. They approached hesitantly, clearly intimidated by the military and government officials who continued to seek me out. "Alexandra." My father began his usual authoritative tone, notably absent. "That was quite a ceremony." "Thank you for coming," I replied formally, maintaining the emotional distance that now felt necessary for self-preservation. Marcus cleared his throat, his confident Wall Street swagger nowhere to be found. "I owe you an apology," he said, uncharacteristic humility in his voice. "I've been arrogant and dismissive about your service. I had no idea what you've really been doing." "No," I agreed simply. "You didn't. You never bothered to find out." My mother's eyes filled with tears as she struggled to process what she'd witnessed. "When they described what happened to your helicopter, how you were wounded but still saved those men, I couldn't breathe thinking about how close we came to losing you." "I tried to tell you about being wounded," I reminded her gently. "You said I probably tripped over equipment." She flinched at the reminder, the weight of her dismissal finally hitting home. My father approached last, his expression more serious than I'd ever seen it. The man who'd built his identity on academic achievement looked humbled in a way that would have been unimaginable months earlier. "I saw how those generals spoke to you," he said quietly. "The respect in their eyes. I've been in academia for 40 years and never earned the kind of respect you have from these people." Major Davis, my former team leader, appeared at my side before I could respond. "Carter was the finest combat medic I've ever worked with," he said, not bothering to introduce himself to my family. "When we were surrounded and taking fire, she crawled across open ground to treat wounded soldiers' shrapnel in her own leg and still provided the coordinates that saved our lives." My family stared speechlessly as he continued. 15 soldiers are alive today because of her medical skills. 27 hostages were rescued because of intelligence she helped gather while bleeding in the desert. She's a genuine American hero." I maintained my composure, unwilling to break down in this moment that belonged to me and the people who had recognized my worth long before today. "I should join the other recipients for the official photographs," I said, neither accepting nor rejecting their overtures. As I walked away, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete independence from their judgment. The ceremony had revealed the truth not just about my service, but about the unbridgeable gap between who they thought I was and who I had always been. But this moment was just the beginning of how my family would have to rebuild everything they thought they knew about me. 6 months after the White House ceremony, I found myself in a place I'd never expected, teaching the next generation of combat medics at the Army Medical Department Center in San Antonio. My innovations at Walter Reed combined with my decorated field experience made me uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between classroom theory and battlefield reality. Your job isn't just to teach procedures, Colonel Wright explained during my transition briefing. It's to prepare them mentally for moments when everything depends on their training. Teaching gave me purpose that transcended personal recognition. Every student I trained carried forward not just technical skills, but the psychological resilience that had kept me steady under fire. I was multiplying my impact, ensuring future medics would be better prepared than I'd been for the weight of holding someone's life in their hands. Meanwhile, something unexpected began happening with my family. The White House ceremony had shattered their preconceptions so completely that they seemed to be rebuilding their understanding of me from scratch. 3 weeks after the ceremony, my father appeared unannounced at my apartment. "I'd like to understand what you do," he said simply, standing awkwardly at my door in casual clothes, something I'd rarely seen him wear. "If you're willing to show me." That visit marked the beginning of a slow, often uncomfortable rebuilding. My father, the prestigious academic who had dismissed my career for years, asked questions and actually listened to the answers. He watched with genuine interest as I demonstrated emergency medical techniques to a class of trainees. When a senior officer greeted me with obvious respect, I saw something new in his eyes, not just acknowledgement but pride. "I've been arrogant," he admitted over dinner that evening. "I measured success by such narrow standards that I couldn't see the value in what you've accomplished." My mother made her own attempts at reconciliation through care packages that began arriving regularly, something she'd never done during my deployments. Inside one box, I found my grandfather's military photo and medals items I'd never seen displayed in their home. "Your grandfather would have been so proud," her note read. "I should have made that connection sooner." Marcus surprised me most of all. He began volunteering with a veterans legal aid program, offering pro bono services to help former service members navigate benefits and disability claims. "I wanted to understand your world better," he explained during one of our now regular phone calls. "These veterans have opened my eyes to what service really means." 3 months after the ceremony, I agreed to attend a family therapy session during a visit home. In that sterile office, with a compassionate but firm therapist, my parents finally articulated what had driven their dismissal of my military service. "I was terrified from the moment you enlisted," my mother confessed, tears streaming down her face. "Every news report about casualties felt like a knife in my heart. It was easier to pretend your job wasn't dangerous than to face that fear every day." My father, always more reserved with emotions, struggled to express his own revelation. Finally, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a worn military recruitment brochure from the 1970s with notes in his handwriting. "I was all set to join the medical corps after college," he said quietly. "Had my physical signed the paperwork. Your grandfather talked me out of it, said he'd seen enough Carter men come home damaged by war. He wanted something different for me." He looked at me with new understanding. "I think I was hard on you partly because you had the courage to follow a path I abandoned." The therapy helped us navigate years of miscommunication and hurt, establishing healthier patterns for moving forward. We would never have the easy closeness some families enjoyed, but we were learning to respect our differences and find common ground. That Thanksgiving, my first holiday home in years, felt like stepping into an alternate reality. My mother had invited both my military friends and their academic colleagues. The table represented two worlds that had once seemed incompatible. She had displayed my medals in the living room alongside Marcus's achievements and my father's academic awards. When a family friend asked about the Distinguished Service Cross, it was my father who explained its significance with unmistakable pride. "Only 16 have been awarded during the global war on terror," he said. "Alexandra's actions saved dozens of American lives." One evening at the training center, a young recruit approached me after class. "Sergeant Carter, I joined because of the news stories about you," she said earnestly. "I wanted to make that kind of difference." "The medals don't make the medic," I told her, seeing something of my younger self in her determined face. It's the willingness to run toward the wounded when everyone else is running away. It's doing your job even when no one is watching or understanding its importance. As I spoke those words, I realized I was finally free from needing my family's approval. The president's recognition had changed how my family saw me, but the truth was more profound. His words hadn't made me valuable, they had merely illuminated the value that was already there. Sometimes the people who understand your value least are those who should know it best, but your worth was never theirs to determine. I learned that the hard way standing in that White House ceremony where the most powerful man in the world had to tell my parents who their daughter really was. The medals don't make the medic, the recognition doesn't create the worth. Sometimes you have to save 42 lives before your family realizes you were never the failure, you were exactly who you were meant to be.